yet, but I would say there's no basis for feeling comfortable about that. It's a risk that we simply can't run that risk. We can't allow a wage price spiral to happen, and we can't allow inflation expectations to become unanchored. It's just something that we can't allow to happen, and so we'll look at it that way.
Federal Reserve Chairman Jerome Powell says the central bank is committed to regaining control over inflation, even as he acknowledged that the Fed has lost a little power to address its visible symptoms at the gas pump or at the supermarket. Powell addressed the Senate Banking Committee Wednesday, a week after the Fed ordered the largest interest rate increase since 1994. The central bank is under growing pressure to combat inflation, which hit 4-decade high of 8.6 in May, now 9.1. Quote, "We need to get inflation back down to 2%, Powell told lawmakers. "We're using our tools to do that, and the public should believe that we will get inflation back down to 2% over time," end of quote. Powell stressed the economy is well positioned to withstand higher interest rates, although he acknowledged that the war in Ukraine and the lingering supply chain problems increase the risk of an economic slowdown. Let's laugh at that one. Quote, "It's certainly a possibility," Powell said. "It's not our intended outcome at all, but it's certainly a possibility." Let's continue. Quote, "We're trying to provoke and don't think that we will need to provoke a recession," he added, "but we do think it's absolutely essential that we restore price stability, really for the benefit of the labor markets as much as anything else." The Wall Street Journal put the odds of a recession in the next 12 months at 44%, up from 28% in April. Kind of high, right? Powell argued that predicting a recession is notoriously difficult, but added that he doesn't see the risk as practically high. So let's get more information. See him in action. Editor, roll clip.
Exacerbating the housing crisis?
Well, so by raising rates, we're clearly what you're seeing is a slowing housing market now. You're seeing because of higher interest rates, mortgage rates have gone up pretty substantially, and you're seeing a slowing in the housing market. And that should mean, one of the things that should mean is that housing prices should stop going up at such remarkably rapid rates. Since the beginning of the pandemic, we've had a very, very hot housing market all around the country. And, what should take place is as demand moderates demand for housing moderates for new and existing homes, you should see prices stop going up quite so fast. You're also going to see fewer home sales, anything about, but it is an important issue.
Right. How inflation has escalated over the past 18 months. Would you say that the war in Ukraine is the primary driver of inflation in America?
No, inflation was high certainly before the war in Ukraine broke out.
I'm glad to hear you say that. The Biden administration seems to be intent on deflecting blame, and as recently as just this past Sunday, spread the misinformation that Putin's invasion of Ukraine is the, quote, biggest single driver of inflation. I'm glad you agree with me that that is not the truth. I'd like to turn to the situation we find ourselves in now, tightening. A recent survey of global CEOs showed that more than 60% of executives expect a recession in the next 18 months. Meanwhile, per its most recent forecast, the Fed will be tightening monetary policy for the next 2.5 years. Thus, the Fed could soon find itself in the challenging position of potentially exacerbating an economic downturn in order to address the historic inflation that's been unleashed by the Biden administration. So, Mr. Chairman, as you know, the Fed has a dual mandate, stable prices and maximum employment. As we look to the fall, how do you think about balancing this potential tension between the Fed's two mandates, particularly if the economic outlook worsens, but inflation remains elevated?
So we do have a dual mandate, as you point out. Right now, the labor market is extremely tight and I would say unsustainably hot. There's a mismatch between supply and demand there. As you know, there's more job openings than there are, by a factor of 2 to 1, than there are unemployed people looking for work. On the inflation side, we're very far from our target. So we think that we have to restore price stability to put the economy back in a place where in the medium and longer term we can have a sustained period of what we would call maximum employment. So that's how we're thinking about it. Of course, we're not We're not trying to provoke and don't think that we will need to provoke a recession. But we do think it's absolutely essential that we restore price stability, really for the benefit of the labor market as much as anything else.
Yeah, I agree.
As I mentioned earlier, we're very strongly committed to using our tools to get inflation to come down. The way to do that is to slow down growth, ideally keep it positive, and as I mentioned, supply and demand get back into balance. So that's what we're trying to accomplish. Is there a risk that we would go too far? Certainly there's a risk. But I wouldn't agree that it's the biggest risk to the economy. I think that, the bigger mistake to make, let's put it that way, would be to fail to restore price stability. And it's what Augustine was speaking to earlier, a low inflation environment or regime is what we've had. And that is one in which inflation is low and no one pays any attention to inflation, and that's called rational inattention because it doesn't matter. When there's a big inflation spike, if it's going to go away, we would ignore it and sort of play through it because it'll go away and it won't affect people's understanding. But to the extent there are a series of shocks, it does become rational for people to pay more and more attention. And I think the clock is kind of running on, how long will you remain in a low inflation regime where most of the changes in inflation are actually idiosyncratic as opposed to broadly across the macroeconomy. So the risk is that because of a multiplicity of shocks, you start to transition into a higher inflation regime. And our job is literally to prevent that from happening. And we will prevent that from happening. We will not allow a transition from a low inflation environment into a high inflation environment.
Do you see evidence that there is a psychological shift going on inflation? Thanks.
We don't really see strong evidence of that yet, but that does not in any way make us comfortable. I think if you look at short-term inflation expectations, they're quite elevated. And you can look at that and say, well, that's because people expect inflation to come down. And in fact, inflation expectations come down fairly sharply. Longer-term inflation expectations have been reasonably stable, but have moved up but only to levels where they were in 2014 by some measures. So you can look at that, and I think that's a fair description of the picture. But it's really about the risks. We don't see a wage price spiral. We see that companies have the ability to raise prices, and they're doing that, but there have been price shocks. So I just think it takes you back to the basic point was that we know we need to expeditiously move our policy rate up to ranges of more normal, neutral levels, and we need to look around and keep going if we don't see that financial conditions have tightened adequately or that the economy is behaving in ways that suggest that we're not where we need to be. But I would say there's no basis for feeling comfortable about that. It's a risk that we simply can't run that risk. We can't allow a wage price spiral to happen, and we can't allow inflation expectations to become unanchored. It's just something that we can't allow to happen, and so we'll look at it that way.
Hey guys, it's Jose, your regular Joe Blow again, keeping an eye out and my ears open to the feds and the excuses that they just love to sell us. But we are not buying anything right now. It costs too much. Do your own research, as always. It's always good to do your research, guys. Just don't blatantly follow a random guy on YouTube. Get the facts the way you understand it. And thank you guys for sticking with me to the end. As always, more coming soon. Stay free.
It ain't hard to tell. I excel, then prevail.